Yes. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just wanted to welcome everybody and hand the mic over to our key speaker for this presentation segment, Professor Woods.
All right, thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Professor King, Professor Piscopo. It's an honor to be here. As we begin this panel discussion on dissecting the African Continent Free Trade Area Agreement, as I tell my students at Howard Law, I would argue that this is the most important social justice initiative of our lifetime. Normally, we equate social justice with social issues. However, I argue that there is no social justice without economic justice, and the way our global economy is structured still highlights and promotes remnants of colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism. Please, slide 2. So if we look at our economic structure now, there's really two economies, right? There's a resource-based economy, which is based on cheap, free raw materials, cheap, free labor, versus an industrial-based economy, where the resource economy feeds the development and productions of goods and products. So where did this derive from? Let's look at the interconnection between colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism. Colonialism, think of slavery. Rich countries, rich businesses carved up the world and exploited people and things. So the economies are based on, again, free labor, slave trade, as well as the exploitation of natural resources, raw materials within targeted regions, which just happen to be Black and brown. Neocolonialism. Let's look at these regions, these Black and brown regions now as free states, free countries, independent countries. However, the colonial structure still exists. So now that exploitation is taking place within sovereign countries. And imperialism, for those countries that showed resistance, neocolonialism was force through military force or diplomacy. All right. Next slide. So in essence, the foundation of our global economy, again, is based on free, cheap labor versus industrial-based economies that produce those resources and use that labor. So let's look at Africa as a continent. These are the resources plus more that they produce. So in essence, there is not a good or product in the world that is not produced from natural resources or raw materials from the continent of Africa. However, the continent only produces 2% to 6% of world trade. That means manufactured products, that they create the actual product. So here's an analogy. Everyone knows someone with a t-shirt business, right? You buy the t-shirt at bulk, typically from China, for little or nothing. You design the t-shirt, you make the t-shirt. Now you sell the t-shirt at a markup. After it's designed, based on your materials and costs, you mark it up 5 times what it costs to make you. However, to make the t-shirt, excuse me. However, in this analogy, Africa would be the t-shirt prior to the design and markup, meaning it's the raw material, the initial material, but it does not contribute or it does not take part in the markup or the extended cost of the product. Next slide. So in the 60s, early 1900s and the 1960s, 2 significant figures, Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, both realized that in order to fend off or fight colonialism, neocolonialism, imperialism, it was going to take Pan-Africanism, individuals of African descent coming together with strategies and approaches to address the systemic economic structure. Marcus Garvey promoted economic unification. So he believed that if we create a Black economy, we traded with Black countries, Black regions, with products produced by Black businesses, that in essence will begin the process of creating a system that was the antithesis of colonialism, neocolonialism, imperialism, right? So he created the Black Star Line, right? So he linked or attempted to link North America, the Caribbean, and Africa by trading these manufactured goods produced by Black businesses. And for hip hop aficionados, if you recognize Black Star from Mos Def, Talib Kweli, that's where they got the name. All right. So this is embedded in our culture from not only a historical standpoint, but from a hip hop standpoint. And he ran this company through his Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. Black Star Line was in existence from 1919 to 1922. So then Kwame Nkrumah took it a step further. Not only did we need economic unification, we needed political unification. So he became the first president of a free Black sub-Saharan African country. And again, he believed that the only way you can hold off colonialism, neocolonialism, imperialism was to have unifications of free Black countries within the continent of Africa. So he developed the Organization of African Unity, which became what's known today as the African Union, where the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement was developed. All right, next slide. So the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement is the next step in this movement towards liberation. So if Garvey and Nkrumah had an ideological baby, it would be this area agreement. So it combines economic unification and political unification. It was brokered under the Union. So there are 55 countries in Africa. 54 countries are a party to this agreement. The only country that's not a party is Eritrea. The objective is to integrate the African economy, to create one Africa market. Trade started in January 2021. Again, this area, this agreement is a hedge. It's not only to build Africa and advance from an economic standpoint, but it's also the antithesis or hedge against colonialism, neocolonialism, imperialism. So the approach is to shift from an AIDS-based economy or a resource-based economy to more of an industrialized economy. All right, and that's a quick overview of how we got here. And I'll turn it over to Professor King.
Thank you so much, Professor Woods. That is a solid foundation for our discussion to continue, and we are joined by very knowledgeable panelists. This is Africa Awareness Week. Please come on. And I want to pose a couple of questions just to facilitate. If I could pose a question to Ms. Ford, a little bit about, if you wanted to expand on the origins of this idea, could you identify even older roots or more expansive roots that will help people understand the full reach beyond, even Nkrumah and Garvey, who are both extremely important? Is there a more full picture you want to add?
Right. So thank you so much for that question, and great jobs, Professor Woods, with giving us a foundation understanding on how we got here in terms of Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. One thing I like to say is we're at a very critical time in history where we've learned the colonial systems, but we're cognizant enough to know who they center, right? Who they center. And we, as practitioners, are also in a space where there's an opportunity. The time, economies, policies, desires are ripe for us to create new formats that center Black people, or Black countries, actually, emerging markets. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement does that. But in the spirit of thinking about new formats, what I realized is we also need to be thinking in 100 years. And just to add on to what Professor Wood shared with us, back in 1963, through the Organization of African Union, they also created Agenda 2063, which essentially looked at Africa in 100 years. So what we have now is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is phase 1. And there are actually other phases that are to accommodate, developing intra-Africa trade. There's also always been the desire to have one currency, one passport, which also generates and just encourages trade across borders. So where we are in the continuum and just grand scheme of things, we're in phase 1 of this 100-year agenda to see Africa emerge from colonial structures, if you will. So I'll say that that's probably an addition that kind of gives us some context of the history, and that can support us in where we are now and how we should also be thinking about policy as it pertains to emerging markets, and most specifically African or Black emerging markets.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we have a broader context now. We have a vision 100 years from now, right? Really clear that this is not a short-term plan. It's not a temporary patch to, right? And this begins a good 100 years ago, right? So understanding that if imperialism and colonialism, right, are solid 500 years old, affecting African peoples, that this is something that's going to take some time to address, and that African leaders are thinking in terms of that timeline. It's wonderful. So, Mr. Amoo, could I ask you a broad question, a really broad question? What problems does the AFCFTA provide tools to solve?
That's a great question. Thank you, Professor King. And thank you to Ms. Ford and Mr. Wood for laying the groundscape. So I think in answering your question, I'll touch on some of the topics that have been raised in the previous question. The primary problem that the AFCFTA seeks to solve today is germane in the points that and the problems that Nkrumah and Garvey were wrestling with over 100 years ago, which is today, Africa sits at the first step of the value chain, which is the part of the value chain which has the least treasure in it, so to speak. When you take a raw commodity and you sell it into the industrial production process, all of the economic value accrues to it as you transform that raw commodity. So if you take an example of someone who needs to eat canned corn, right? You have raw maize and you have raw tin. You extract that from a place like Africa, you take it to a place like the United Kingdom or America, you manufacture it into canned corn, and then sell it back to Africa, right? So if anyone who's a student of trading or economics knows, you will lose money on every round trip, right? Because you're selling it for a very low price, and then you're buying back the same thing effectively at a higher value. So what AFCFTA seeks to do is create an economic incentive to do production-based activity in Africa. In layman's term, Africa needs to make stuff. So for the history of Africa's post-colonial interaction with the world, pre-colonial is a different story. We actually, Africa did actually manufacture things prior and create value and traded those things abroad to capture economic value to Africa. So he who manufactures is he who brings value to where they are. You capture value in the manufacturing process from other people. And when you capture those economic rents to yourself in the form of profits, you grow your economy, you create the basis to provide social services, et cetera. So today, Africa selling primarily raw commodities is essentially never going to get out of a certain poverty trap, because there's just not enough I'll give you an example. A place like Nigeria is one of the world's leading exporters of oil and gas. So a common question is why is a country that exports oil and gas so poor? And if you think about the amount of oil and gas versus, Nigeria has 200 million people. So selling, no matter how much, that much oil and gas divided by 200 million people on a per capita basis, you actually don't have so much oil and gas to sell, unlike a Saudi Arabia, which has a very small population. So it seems rich, but really you're dividing that money across a very small population. So it's actually not as much money as it seems like. The problem with trying to create a production capability is you need scale. So to make manufacturing economic, you need to make a lot of things at the same time. If you think back to Ford and his Model T, you want to make a lot of very similar things also, right? So each thing's unit cost is very low, and then you can sell it for a price where there's a differential between that sell price and your cost of manufacturing, and that's your margin, profit. And so each individual African country is quite small. We've been balkanized by colonialism. One thing that doesn't get pointed out often enough is that the African borders weren't created by Africans, but we are where we are in these countries that we have. Most of them are very small. Many are not economically viable on their own. They certainly don't have large enough markets to be interesting to make the investment required to manufacture for that population. So the simple idea of AFCFTA is let's fold all of these African countries into one market where there's not the frictions of tariffs across borders and all of the rules and conventions the same. So you can just treat it as one market. Then it becomes economically interesting to set up manufacturing capabilities, because now you can service the 1.3 or whatever the number is, 1.3 billion people there are in Africa as one market, and that investment now makes sense. So that's really what AFCFTA is trying to solve for.
Love it, love it. So we hear some clarity around the solutions. Professor Woods, I teach a class, Africana Muslims, and one of the figures that we have to talk about is Edward Wilmot Blyden, right? 19th century Pan-Africanist figure, somewhat controversial depending on your perspective, who made this argument that Africa, and he's one of the earliest figures to really talk about continent-wide, right, peoplehood, if you will, of Africans, that Africa would not get free if it continued to Christianize under European tutelage, right? He makes this argument that there's a need to address this problem, and he actually advocates Islam as a continent-wide religion to facilitate mental liberation of African people, and then they can become Christian after. He said, actually, most people leave that out. But I wonder what people hearing that today, who often think of North Africans as not really Africans or not wanting to be Africans, and they would hear about this continent-wide agreement and say, but are they really going to participate? Is that going to be a problem? And I'm wondering, as I think about your knowledge base, you have a lot of experience with both the continent and the diaspora. And I'm wondering, is that also something that people may think, okay, is this agreement really taking into account the problem of what do you do with the diaspora?
It's a great question. So two things. One of the benefits of Nkrumah is not only is he from Africa, but he was trained at an HBCU, so Lincoln University. So he understood that Black economic development was interdependent, not only on the continent, but for those that did not live on the continent, right? And interesting enough, the diaspora is baked into the principles of the African Union, right? So the African Union is divided into 6 regions. The diaspora is recognized as a region. And why is that significant? So think about it. And Franklin touched on it. The continent of Africa has been stripped, cast aside, and really generally has not participated in this global economy. Let's fast forward. We look at the African American community as well as the Caribbean community. Same thing. We're on the periphery. However, the benefit of the diaspora, we've had individuals that have traveled the world, have trained throughout the world, educated throughout the world, more importantly, have practiced business. So based on, as Lakeisha stated, the stage we're in regards to this development initiative, we're at phase one, and capacity is an issue. Let's be frank about it, right? It's not too many people that look like us that practice in this space. So it has to be an all hands on deck approach, drawn from resources, knowledge base throughout the world for this to work. So when you look at this strategy, and it's brilliant, Pan-African strategy, which is baked into the African Union, let's look to China, right? China's development is based on their diaspora, right? So there is going to be no development of Africa or even individuals of the diaspora without Africa being one. There's a comprehensive strategy in Africa that promotes economic development that the diaspora can support, align with, collaborate with, and build upon. All right. So because we're in phase one, we've been shut out of the global economy. From a capacity standpoint, we're just simply not there yet. We need individuals from all over the world, various regions, various levels of expertise to contribute to this effort. And most importantly, to provide businesses from around the world where the basis of that business is Black, to collaborate and partner with African-based companies to move this initiative forward.
If I could just add to what Professor Wood said, just as such an important topic. I happen to, this is on a personal note, I happen to be born and raised in Brooklyn with two Nigerian parents. And my lifelong passion really has become uniting the diaspora with the African continent. I think it's critical, not only for the success, I think the reasons why the diaspora wants to connect to the continent probably are obvious, but I actually think it's also existential for the continent to harness the talent and energy and foresight of the diaspora. And I really actually don't think that the continent will get anywhere until it actually does. I'm a strong believer in that. And I think just on a practical level, to we can get into the ideology behind that, and I'm happy to do so later on. But just on a practical level, the diaspora has access to the world's richest markets as native residents of those markets, right? It's very, very difficult to penetrate the US or European market for outside groups. Working together synergistically, having the people who remain resident in the diaspora, working with people who produce on the continent and manufacture on the continent. And we as an investment firm are involved in some of these projects right now, where we're looking to set up and establish manufacturing capabilities on the continent to feed retail and distribution type businesses that will be in the United States or the Caribbean or Europe. These are obvious low-hanging fruit. And to the professor's point as well, again, drawing on our experience as a private equity firm, the types of skill sets you need: marketing, management, engineering, product design, to be an effective and competitive production entity anywhere in the world. The reality is Africa does not have that human capital today. And we can talk about all the reasons why that is, but on the flip side, in the Americas, you have an enormous population of highly trained African Americans who are facing glass ceilings, who are not being valued in corporate America. And there's just an obvious bid-ask spread, to borrow the parlance of trading. There's an obvious connection point there where the production capability that's trying to be developed in Africa for the AFC-FTA to be successful could benefit enormously from HBCU graduates, from all of the wonderful talent that you have in the Caribbean and the African American population, to drive those companies forward and create opportunity for themselves, but also be a part of this development story. And I'll just close. I don't want to hog the mic, but something that's critical, and the reason why I decided to join this panel, besides the fact that John and I go way back, is African Americans in the Caribbean, and I don't have any authority, but I guess I am African. My parents are from Africa. We have to change the narrative. Africa is your birthright too, and I urge African Americans and Caribbeans to claim the African continent as their own, not a place they need to be invited to, not a place they need to go visit, but as to feel central to being a part of the story of how Africa moves forward and how Africa succeeds.
I love that ending note that you gave there. And again, the Africana Muslims study bit has really awakened my vision to. We usually hear diaspora and we think Atlantic diaspora, but imagine the continued process of awakening the Indian Ocean diaspora as well, being able to sort of act on both fronts, if you will, is the promise is amazing. Let's see. We have a question from one of our organizers, which seems pretty important. So I'll go ahead and share this, and this is open for any of our three panelists. Which industries have seen growth already as a result of the agreement? In other words, how are investors getting the most bang for their buck already, even though these are the initial stages of the implementation of the agreement? Anyone have any knowledge on that?
I'll just speak generally, and then I'm going to defer to Franklin, because I think he operates in that space a lot more than I do. It's really too early.
Yeah.
Right. But what I will say is, and it's an interesting debate going on now that I happen to be part of, and it's this agreement versus AGOA, which is the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So the debate is AGOA is up, and it's a preferential agreement where sub-Saharan African countries, businesses in those countries can export to the US duty-free. So the debate is, because of this new agreement, should AGOA be, in essence, done with, right? That's the debate. But what we do know from AGOA, textile industry, manufacturing, as well as the automotive industry has benefited from that. It started out like gangbusters in the early 2000s when Clinton first enacted it. However, it slowed substantially. So the debate is, should we do away with it? Should we modify it to align with the AFCFTA? What's the next step? So I'll turn it over to Franklin. That's kind of where we are in regards to Africa-US relations and investment. But the hope is, again, that the AFCFTA becomes more of a production side as opposed to an aid side and resource side economic structure.
Yeah, Professor Woods, I think is spot on the money. It's too early to tell, but I think what's important to talk about, Jermaine, in this question is, where is the opportunity and where can you kind of get things moving most quickly? And in that, I'll also talk about some of the risks, because there are some important risks that we should be aware of with this AFCFTA if it's not addressed properly. I think the low-hanging fruit is for Africa to become self-sufficient. Right now, Africa imports a lot of things which it's not really sensible to import. And we talked about that losing money on every trade kind of situation that Africa finds itself in today, being primarily an exporter of raw commodities. Being able to, for instance, Africa produces abundant amounts of raw cotton. There's no sensible reason why you couldn't create a textile and apparel industry around that. Africa obviously has a lot of agricultural produce, which could be, but also imports an enormous amount of food, which is just sort of, these are sort of silly things that can be corrected very quickly. Things like palm and palm oil, which goes into lipstick and cosmetics and to all sorts of things. So there are a lot of FMCG, consumables, apparel. I think those are all probably going to be the sort of first movers. And then down the line, you can start to think about more complex, white goods and automotives and other kind of products. I think that's probably bucket one, is making it self-sufficient. You probably see those priorities move first to displace some imports. I think further afield and sort of medium term, but not too far away, I could see particularly African American and Caribbean, sort of basically Black heritage oriented, say cosmetics, hair care products, et cetera, manufactured on the African continent for those markets in the US and the Caribbean and maybe parts of Europe. Now, to talk about some of the risks that one should be aware of, Africa is, believe it or not, because mostly Africa is portrayed as quite poor, it's actually a very big market for lots of people, particularly Europeans. Europe exports quite a number of consumer products to Africa, and is seen as a captive market for particularly countries like France. And then obviously, the Chinese and other low-cost manufacturing jurisdictions. So there is a fair possibility that if the member states of the African Continental Free Trade Area don't work together and aren't disciplined about the monitoring and supervision of the trade union, you could get what they call dumping, right? So if you get a weak country within this 54 country mix that says, I can't really manufacture, but I could do a deal with Chinese companies to bring in, low cost product, and China makes that worth my while, I can then benefit from this free zone and sell products that aren't actually made in Africa. So Africa is not getting the benefit of that manufacturing complement, and circulate. And other countries could do the same. So I think what needs to happen quite quickly is financiers, government regulators, and others who can protect and incubate industries and companies as they grow. Because let's tell the truth, no country in the world got rich by pure free markets, right? There has to be an incubation and protection of companies until they can really compete. The market environment is brutal and ruthless, right? And our companies starting off fledgling are not going to compete with American, Chinese, and British companies. That's not realistic. So the AFCFTA's, the minders, have to really be serious about that incubation piece of companies, so that we don't fall prey to non-African companies coming in and dumping goods and killing our nascent businesses.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Franklin. Definitely a great point. Just to speak a little bit more on the juxtaposition between theory and actual practice. So yes, we understand what the policy is about, what it's intended to do. And the question is, okay, where are we now? And yes, it is too early. Literally last year, we implemented a digital marketing campaign across Africa, as in my company, implemented a digital marketing campaign across Africa on behalf of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, to literally understand and collect data on what the experience is like for traders, SMEs at the borderline. So literally, we're in a data collection space in terms of implementation. And that was just, I think it was ending of 2021 into 22. Now, in terms of this issue that Franklin brought up, making sure that we're not almost overshadowing the original products or products that are originated in Africa. There's a protocol that's in our phase 1 called Rules of Origin. And the idea is that we are supposed to understand literally the value chain of a product. And if in fact the value chain or each input of the product is originated in Africa, then there's almost preferential treatment in terms of tariffs, in terms of the actual process of trade. And in terms of like actual implementation and example, we have a company here in Ghana called McDan Shipping, Ghanaian owned. They have put forth, you know, in terms of process and their policy on literally giving preferential treatment to products that have been originated in Africa to go across borders. So it is very much the beginning phase, but I also want us to take a step back and understand how these things work in terms of policy and actual implementation. There is a process called, you know, where they develop protocols, and then in the process of implementation, there's the testing. So remember that Agenda 2063, it's 2023. We're now in phase 1. We're literally at the beginning of the entire trade policy. And we're now seeing countries and private companies join together, public-private partnership, or sometimes it's a private-to-private company across borders that are coming together to develop trade systems, knowledge sharing, things of that sort. So it's very early. However, there are efforts to see that the protocols are put in place so that it benefits actual African companies.
Thank you. Now that fleshed it out. So we've got theory, we got some early stuff. I do want to direct the questions specifically, and I see we have a couple of student questions, so we want to add those in if we can. But the formal period of the panel talk is coming to an end, and I know we have a faculty moderator, Dr. Piscopo, who can talk a little bit about some of these efforts, continent-wide free trade agreements, and how they have panned out in other settings.
Yeah, few comments, great presentation so far and great discussion. So many issues to consider. There's, the parallelism with other agreements that have preceded in other areas, and especially Latin America, because there may be some, elements there that are, the elements of colonialism and then neo-colonialism, even though we can argue that there are forces that are different, and I'm gonna set that aside. But other than that, just thinking about the important areas of connectivity and all the specific practical issues to get, I love the idea that aspirational may be similar to the European Union, eventually with a monetary union, with an area of free movement for labor and for individuals. And that may be, as you say, 100 years from now. Practically now, what are the next steps? And I think those have been actually been mentioned. So the first step is just a free trade zone with some levels of protectionism that I understand. One of my points is that protectionism, how temporary should be, because I perfectly understand that companies in Africa cannot immediately compete with global companies, but eventually you want them to be able to do it. So I'm not offering, solutions now, but I think just always considering some temporary protectionism, but that companies know that eventually they will need to do. That's one of my, issues. The other issue that I think is very important is to get the different countries with different bureaucracies and different governments to really agree on all those measures that have to be taken. Because there is always competition from the local governments and the local bureaucracies. Morehouse visited Ghana, and a group from Morehouse, and we talked with the Ghanaian ambassador, and the position of the embassy is to support fully this agreement. And one of the comments they made is that they could see lots of everyone is in agreement as to the goal, but there is lack of agreement of the steps that they need to take in which order to get there. And even there is a little more understanding among some of the West African countries, but then you take it to the East African countries, and the sub-Saharan region is extremely large. And then there is the other element of conflict and war and all that. So I don't have solutions. I'm just bringing up issues that I think are very important, and that I also think is very important for our students, the diaspora, to get connected, even if you don't move to a country in Africa. But there are many ways to think about investment in African countries and to support all the efforts. So those are my comments, and some of them may be type of questions. Would you say, and my question is, again, comparing two different agreements, we know that aspirationally it may be something similar to the European Union. Right now, it may be more like compared to Mercosur, which is the South American agreement. Where are we right now in terms of practicals in the next 10 years? That's my question.
If I could just dive in, I think that was a great question. Then I'm going to defer, of course, to Franklin and Lakeisha. But based on my discussions with officials from the African Union, the agreement is actually building on what is the strength of Africa, and that's its SMEs, right? So before you can scale up, you have to fortify with what works. And there is, I think 80% of the businesses in Africa fall within the small, mid-size range. In particular, what's very interesting is also a push in regards to support for women-owned businesses. So I think before you could scale up, this whole notion of trade, for some countries, it's brand new. And then when you look at what's driving the local economies, it is the SMEs. So the initial strategy, from my understanding, is based around that. And of course, you build from there once the infrastructure, manufacturing capabilities begin to scale up.
Thanks for that, Professor Wood and Professor Piscopo. I wanted to talk to your comment about the balance between competition and protection. And I think, it begs a bigger question, which is what's the purpose of this? And when I talked about the risk, one of the things that concerns me, we started with a great history lessons and I think it's important to be rooted in history because none of this is new. These are the same conversations people were having back in the 1920s. In fact, people like Garvey and others, and then in the 60s again with Nkrumah and others. And one of the key issues was where are we going, right? And I think that needs to. They used to have things called sort of Pan-African Congresses where both the civil rights leaders, Caribbean liberation leaders, African independence leaders got together and organized a strategy towards those three different goals and worked together and gave each other ideas. And I think something like that probably needs to be convened again because the African Union came out of that that dialogue and that milieu. And I understand that the purpose of the AFCFTA, and we're all here because we know it's important, it's the right direction. Africa 2063, the Africa we want, and all of that good stuff. But the only way to answer Professor Piscopo's question about where is the limit and where do you stop protecting and when do you allow companies to sort of go into the world as fully grown and ready to compete, and which companies do you protect and in which countries, right? As you said, there are 54 countries with different bureaucracies, different political systems. Some draw on the French tradition, some draw on the British tradition, some draw on the Lusophone tradition, some draw on Arabic traditions. There are lots of different places lots of people come from lots of different backgrounds. How do you come together? And where my ultimate conclusion is that Africa needs an industrial policy. And that industrial policy needs to be predicated on African values, if you can agree on what those are. And when I say African, I'm including, the diaspora. I'm big capital A African, right? There needs to be a discussion and a dialogue about where the community is trying to get to. What, if you look at the geopolitical landscape, not just now, but for the next 50, 100 years, where are the opportunities? Where are the risks? Where can we compete? Where do we have unique advantages given our current reality? And how can we develop? And there's some folks in the chat that I've been reading making some interesting points about social values, right? Is this going to be a distributed development? Is it going to be just a development for elites, or are we going to share the pie and include, all parts of our class structure, right? Which is a choice, right? I mean, there's no right answer to that. That's a subjective choice. So long-winded, but I just want to say that in doing all of these things, and it's important to take action and do things, but it's also important to have a plan. Someone referenced China earlier, I think it was Professor Woods. One key factor of China's development was how extraordinarily well planned it was, and the level of detail, the level of effort they spent in planning out what they were going to do. Now, they've obviously course corrected. They've not always followed it to the letter of the plan, but they really did come up with 25, 50, 75, 100-year plans, which gave a lot of certainty and, provided a lot of sort of directionality around some of these very difficult policy choices, right? I mean, to Professor Piscopo's presentation, there aren't obvious, clear, right or wrong answers. I mean, you take different answers depending on where you want to go.
Right.
If I can, I think the last 2 points really direct us to several posts that our own colleague here in sociology at Morehouse, Dr. Cynthia Hewitt, has posted directly pertaining to, right, what we can learn from looking at other places. And there is a central need to, as you said, you look at China, and China's not unique in that it's a primarily planned economy, and the plan said we can't leave our entire population behind and simply enrich, right, those who are already doing well. So I think having those kinds of conversations that lead to concrete policies and approaches to the economics, and even approaches to reading what economic growth really looks like. If I'm trying to summarize a couple of key posts that she made, are really important. But in that spirit, I would like to open it up to students, questions and comments for our last 20 minutes here in the classroom, actually 15 minutes in the classroom setting. I have a room full of my students and as well as Dr. Piscopo's students, and she has a classroom full of her students. There may be a couple of people online I'm missing. No, I think I see everyone online. So anyone in the rooms have some questions? So we do have one that I can go to in the thread, which might represent what many of you all are thinking, as I see heads going, I don't know if I have a question. One of Dr. Piscopo's students asked, as a finance major entering the job market, what African emerging markets could I join to contribute to the progress of Africa and make a decent living as well, right? Your typical finance major coming out of Morehouse is probably 200,000 in debt. So, right, there has to be a question about living, but also contributing. Anyone have thoughts on that? More panelists.
Yeah, I can answer that question. Just to start with, so in terms of being relatable, so I went to Spelman, studied abroad in Ghana. I'm Jamaican American. I founded my communications agency here. There definitely are a lot of business opportunities across sectors, agriculture, finance, investment. As we just spoke about, right now, the policy is geared towards stimulating trade, but not necessarily industrialization. There are businesses through your world banks and even private practices as well. Franklin is a shining example of that, of just different opportunities that you can look into. I bring that up because I really want people to kind of hear what we're saying, but also see themselves within this value chain. It's not enough just to like pull in the information, but really we're encouraging everyone to see themselves as a part of the value chain or the potential of the value chain. So what does this mean? We're saying that it's the policy is encouraging trade, but not industrialization. So maybe we need to be looking into the businesses that are investing capital, as in actual manufacturing capital, the factories that are going to add value to the raw products. Who's doing that? The research needs to be in that direction. And as you come up with that, you can speak to myself, people like Franklin as well, to see the actual players who are in the market and on the grounds doing work, and striking a conversation in terms of internship and seeing if you can be a part of that in that, I would say, informal but connected way.
Yeah, just to talk to, I mean, there's a couple questions here asking basically, how can I get involved? What are the opportunities that exist, et cetera. We are developing with the Congressional Black Caucus and a few others an internship program, both at the early stages of the career and also mid-level, to give exposure to people who live in the United States and are of African descent, what it's like to actually work on the continent. And basically those people will be placed in our portfolio companies to work and help us develop those companies. And those companies are primarily in the manufacturing and the telecommunication spaces. And that's just one program. I think there are quite a few others. There's a program I know of called Jelani, run by a woman called Ashley Company out of South Carolina, and they organize tours predominantly geared towards women, Black women. And she has curated tours taking them to the continent to have a 1 week experience on being immersed. So I think what I'm trying to say is, step one is to de-exoticize the continent for yourself. It needs to be a lot less exotic. It's just a place like anywhere else that has airports. You fly there, you go, there's banks, there's roads, there's police. And I think it sounds silly, but I think that's actually step one for those of us in diasporas to really make it less of an exotic destination and a place that you can realistically think about building a career, building a business, selling products. And to this question about protecting SMEs against conglomerates and monopolized industries that I see in the chat, I think it comes back to a lot of the things that Dr. Hewitt has been saying in the chat today, which is, Africa has problems and challenges, but it also has an opportunity. It has not yet industrialized to the extent that much of the rest of the world has. And while I am a big believer in modernization and benefits of technology and so on, how you choose to incorporate those tools to build a society are not givens, right? We don't necessarily have to photocopy the West. We can learn from the West, we can learn from the East, we can learn from whomever, but we can create a uniquely African future for the African continent, which can be shaped by, guided by, values that we choose, right? And that's an opportunity that doesn't exist in too many other places. So I think going back to my original exhortation at the top of the hour, I really, really think that the diaspora, African Americans and Caribbeans in particular, need to be a strong voice in that conversation and need to insert themselves into that discussion of what Africa's future looks like. And I'll just end this comment by stating this. We're here talking about this because of an idea that Marcus Garvey had. Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican who lived in Harlem, right? And just think about that. The entire African independence movement, really, if you're really honest about it, was frankly driven by Marcus Garvey's ideas. And if they talked about the Black Star Line and how it shows up in hip hop, it also shows up in the Ghanaian flag. That color scheme and the Black Star. Ghanaians call themselves the football team the Black Stars. Kwame Nkrumah intentionally said he named it after Marcus Garvey's Black Star Line that designed the flag. So Caribbeans, African Americans, W.E.B. Du Bois helped write most of Ghana's foundational documents in partnership with Nkrumah. He was Nkrumah's mentor. He died in Ghana. So this is not new. In fact, African Americans and Caribbeans were much more involved in Africa's development 100 years ago than they are now, where today, people think this exotic place that's far away. There are a lot of conflicts between Africans and Caribbeans and African Americans, and all of that is counterproductive. Africa desperately needs the input and participation of the diaspora. And if I leave this conversation with nothing else, I would love to have that message be given across.
Awesome. And if I just want to add briefly, Lakeisha and Franklin are on point in regards to getting there and just assessing the landscape. So this is important as well. When we look at China's development, remember, China's a country. Africa's a continent. So the integration, the approach is going to be monumental, but to Franklin's point, there has to be an industrial strategy. I'm a lawyer, and the business I have in Africa is, all right, we're going to have this integrated economy. What the heck are we going to do about the integrated legal system? There's 54, 55 different legal systems, right? So through my experience, I created the Garvey and Nkrumah Fellowship Program, and where I take students from law schools on the continent, law schools in the Caribbean, as well as HBCU law schools. And what we do is we put them with African government agencies, Caribbean government agencies, US, as well as businesses throughout the diaspora, just to look at how it looks in those different seats from not only an economic standpoint, but from a legal standpoint, and for this cohort to come together and come up with a strategy. How do you integrate a legal infrastructure? Because you can't have an integrated economic structure without an integrated legal structure, right? So
yeah,
it's urgent. It goes across the board. So there's opportunities across the board for anyone that's involved or interested.
just to share quickly, so I've been living in Ghana for 8 years, currently in Accra, speaking to you guys from Accra. Kudos to John for having a diverse panel. So I noticed that there has been a cultural trend in traveling to Africa, which is great. However, we have the narrative of December in Ghana, right? December in Ghana, it's a place you come to party. It's a place that you come to for enjoyment, tourism. You get to connect ancestrally, culturally. However, looking at that, I saw that we're leaving a lot of money on the table. We're leaving a lot of discussions on the table. Ghana is more than just December in Ghana. It's a place of multiple ecosystems. I'm sharing that because I really want us to open our minds in terms of how we see places and how we see ourselves within the trajectory of growing Africa. We are very much a part of it. So of course, when you see a problem, you create solutions. Myself and my team, we created a platform called Africa Beyond Travel. The idea is to go beyond the partying in Ghana, which I've created parties in Ghana as well. But the idea is to go beyond partying in Ghana and go beyond the narrative of slavery. We are more than that. We're more, our trade, our economics precedes the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. There's so much more to our philosophy as well as economics. So Africa Beyond Travel is about looking at the ecosystems here in Ghana and across Africa. And for anybody that's interested, you guys can go to my website on Forward Communications and literally subscribe to your using your email, and we'll keep you posted. This is a program and a platform that's going to roll out this year, but I guess it's an exclusive and just sharing that there are certain spaces and I guess people who are thinking about the growth of the continent and ushering in the diaspora in a way that can be practical and useful for both the diaspora and the African continent. So I would leave you with that. That's a call to action, but also I just want you guys to think about Africa and Ghana beyond the trends, beyond the trade, beyond Afrobeats. We're having a great time, keep it going, but it is more than the cultural surge that we see. we have to keep our eye on the long-term vision because it is a long game.
And Lakeisha, if you could type those sites into the chat, that would be great. And Dr. Piscopo, you had a hand up.
Yes, and this question may be also for Lakeisha, since she's been living in Ghana. Is how do the locals, the native, are they very welcoming with the diaspora? Is there any level of resentment, like feeling, okay, now you come from the United States, like feeling that you know everything and that you are imposing anything to us, or somewhere in between? But when I was there just 10 days, I couldn't get that feeling. But by the way, I loved Accra, and I think it's a great city, and I invite everyone to go visit. And as you say, think about more than just visiting.
Right. So what I'll say is I'm Jamaican American, and if essentially I'm an expat / repat. So I'll start with those, let's say, signifiers. I'm an immigrant here, right? But I will answer your question, but I also want to keep in perspective that I am not specifically Ghanaian, so cannot directly speak as a Ghanaian. But from my observation and what I've seen, it's a diverse response, to be very honest, because independent of our Blackness, we also have the conditioning of being American. A lot of us that come over, it's rooted in awareness. It's rooted in awareness. Sometimes we're not aware of how we interact with a new space. Anyone really, you go to a place with your conditions or how you've been conditioned and how you think about things, how you see yourself. When you travel, it can change. But we have some people who really come with an American mindset, and sometimes we're not aware that it is really on the forefront of how we interact with the space, what we expect from a space. So when you are, let's say, starting with your American ideals or thoughts or expectations, if you're interacting in a space without being open, obviously you might have some friction or pushback. So it really varies, because then there are some who understand when you're in a country, you're there to listen, as in hear, understand how things are being done. You're more open to being adaptable. There are people who do understand that. So it really does vary. And then, to be quite honest, there is a disconnect culturally between, people who travel into Ghana and people who are from Ghana naturally. We see that in America, we see that in Jamaica, we see that in Ghana as well. So it's a diverse, experience, I would say, from what I've observed. But what I would encourage people to do, if you are traveling to any country, but let's talk about Ghana, come with your ears open. Come with your ears open. Come, ready to really receive in terms of information, and also learn more about yourself, but also not forgetting your principles and ideals, your integrity, things of that sort. So it's quite diverse. There's no one answer to that.
And I can add on to that a little bit as someone who, thanks largely to the work of Dr. Cynthia Hewitt, I was able to go to Ghana in 2009 and 2010. I had been, I'll say this previously, I'd been to the region, I'd been to Senegal and the Gambia to teach study abroad programs. Some of our students happen to be ULM classes, so folks who have to go, not a problem. But it stands very powerfully to testimony that I left in 2009 engaged to a Ghanaian. I left in 2010 with a Ghanaian wife. We have spent the last decade raising children here and building businesses there in a house, right? And so, that's because her family was welcome to Black Americans. You could find a Ghanaian family, next door that might have been less sure. So the spectrum is there. And I've been to multiple African countries, and I've experienced that spectrum, and it's not unique to Black Americans. I think sometimes you know, and I'm speaking specifically to Black American slavery, Jim Crow experience for a minute. Sometimes we think that people are responding to us as if they don't respond that way to everyone else. Listen, Ghanaians and Nigerians, right, aren't always getting along. There are all kinds of intra-Ghana, there are groups that aren't always getting along, right? So, you know, putting on a lens, as Ford said, that allows you to begin to understand where people are coming from more so than assuming they're coming from where you're coming from is probably step one, your goal when you visit the continent.
I'll just comment very quickly on this topic. I don't want to belabor it, but I think, you know, the overarching premise to things I tried to say here is that we need to be realistic and we need to be intentional and we need to be ready to do the work, right? You know, Africa and the products of Africa, the human products, you know, the diaspora, those who are in Africa and without, we are starting from a very difficult point, right? At least materially, right? You know, from a material standpoint, you know, we have the lowest share of wealth, lowest share of trade. You know, we have a big security problem, which is, you know, we have a lot of issues, right? And they're all solvable, but they have to be solvable with a realistic mean and an intentionality because they are challenging problems, right? One of those is what we're talking about right now. If you go, you know, to an African country from the United States or somewhere without, you'll, as was said, you'll have a mixed reception. You know, these countries are quite stratified normally. Many of them have very small, very wealthy elites and very large masses who are disenfranchised even within their own country. So your reception is going to be informed by different people's realities, and also just bear in mind one thing, and this is something I try to say a lot when people talk about the frictions between the various parts of diaspora, is most of us don't know anything about each other. And what we've heard about each other is coming from an interlocutor who is not unbiased, right? So, you know, African Americans have learned about Africans from the same interlocutor that Africans have learned about African Americans and Caribbeans and vice versa, right? And that interlocutor has an agenda, right? So I think we have to bear that in mind and spend some time getting to know each other. I think, you know, the first 10, 15 years of this kind of integration process are going to be bumpy. That's just natural, right? I don't know much about you, you don't know much about me. There's going to be that kind of getting to know you process. And then as people do business, as people trade, as people visit, as people engage, Brother King got married, right? You know, this is the kind of outcomes we want. These kinds of things will resolve themselves over time, but it will take time. It will take intentionality, and we have to be realistic and practical about where we're starting from. You know, this kind of, you know, the Wakanda thing is not going to happen, you know, overnight, right? It's got to be a serious effort, and you have to have realism and maturity tempering your expectations.
Yeah.
I think you're being ambitious, Brother Franklin. You said 15 years. I was thinking more 30, but.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I mean, and Rome wasn't built in a day. I mean, look, I mean,
Absolutely.
you know, the encouragement here is that the Chinese essentially were lost to the West, right, in 1949, right? And if you think about, you know, where we are today, you know, that was 70 something years ago, right? And you know, you see where the Chinese have gotten today. You're, irrespective of what your views on the Chinese and whether they're going to take over the world or whether worries people have, just objectively, they've moved 800 million people out of poverty in that time. Now that is within someone's living memory. So there are people who are alive today who remember being dirt poor in a country that was a backwater, who now live in Shenzhen, which is now competing and contesting with the United States for global supremacy. So these things are possible within one human lifespan, but it requires that same level of intentionality and that same level of discipline that they showed in their development.
I have one more question that you started mentioning, but I would like to hear more. So there have been some previous attempts to something like this. What is different this time that can lead to really success?
I think, how do I put this? There is an independence, and I'm not someone who believes Africa is fully independent today, but there is there's more policy independence now than there has ever been. Most of Africa's status as a post-colonial environment happened during the Cold War. And the externalities of the Cold War, I think, greatly constrained policy choices, to put it mildly. Now, someone said something about westernized elites. I think there are some still less visible constraints on policy choices, most notably, the sort of infatuation with sort of neoliberal kind of Bretton Woods type thinking that tends to dominate the thinking of African policymakers. Which again, that is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a thing. And you will, again, when being intentional and think about stuff over the long term, let's also be very clear. As the Chinese experience today is showing us, if you rapidly come out of economic stagnation to economic progress, that will, worry people, right? That will create, a lot of the world has a zero-sum mentality. So if and when Africa begins an economic ascendancy, it has to do so with an understanding that that's not going to be a costless movement, right? You have to start thinking about how will the rest of the world react, how will established wealthy powers react to what was once a source of cheap raw materials, right? Because we sell our raw materials way below value into a cartel, right? The world buys from us in a cartelized fashion from our raw materials. So we're always going to be selling at the worst possible price in a foreign currency that we don't have the ability to create. So there's, and that's a great position for the powers that be today. If we change that dynamic even slightly, and they start to feel the pinch from that, if that costs jobs in Chicago and that costs jobs in the Midlands of the UK, what's the response going to be? So policymakers who are focused on developing Africa and developing AFCFTA have to be very, very alive to the reality of trying to do this. Not everyone's going to be so thrilled that Africa becomes less poor, even though they might say so today.
Yeah, I also want to just share just a small caveat. I keep talking about the juxtaposition between policy and practice. What I will say is, as someone who's living here real time, 8 years, we have a lot of innovation that policy has not been able to catch up to. There are fintech companies here that created their own coins back in 2015, 2016, chatbots, artificial intelligence. It's been happening here on the continent. So independent of policy, I also want people to know and realize that the innovation tick is on an uptick. And we have a situation where policy, it's way behind. The Bank of Ghana just got some type of rubric for fintech companies, but those companies have been innovating for the past 6 to 8 years, I would say. So that's also something for people to think about in terms of artificial intelligence, and also where Africa lies in that conversation. We're talking about ChatGPT. There are localized ChatGPTs that literally respond back to you in languages from the African continent. People are building their own innovation through AI. So that's also something to consider. Yes, we're talking about policy, and it is important to have it so that we have an infrastructure, but what's happening on the ground is that businesses and really the Gen Zers and younger populations, they're innovating. They're innovating past your Cash Apps, past whatever we've seen stateside. It's here in Africa.
I just want to give a time check. We have about 5 minutes left, I think, before I want to be respectful of our panelists' time. I think we're going to have at least one and maybe two that definitely need to drop off. So if we've got some burning questions out there, I think maybe we've got time for one more. Did I see one from you, Professor Piscopo, or?
Well, it was very interesting that we spent some time in the integration of the diaspora. I think that's a very important key in terms of the skills and the knowledge and all that. But another aspect of the diaspora is the investment. I don't know how much of all this vision can be achieved without foreign direct investment. And I know it was briefly mentioned, but also it links to China because China has been pouring money into the continent for several years. So how do you see the diaspora as investors in all this vision as well?
If I could jump in, I think Lakeisha raised it earlier. Rules of origin is so important, even for the diaspora, because again, from a value chain perspective, it's going to be a draw or a magnet to the continent. There will be opportunities to create opportunities or businesses or be part of a value chain by starting out in the continent, whether it's through moving there or in collaboration and partnership. So just certain basic components of trade with this trade agreement in place that's really pushing for the harmonization of Africa, I think it actually creates a magnet, an easy approach for folks of the diaspora to not only link, but also serve as a magnet for foreign direct investment.
Yes, and the truth is, where the policy is, like I said, it encourages trade, but not industrialization, and we have to have a diverse approach. If we stay, focused just on trade, one of the negatives of the policy is that we can kind of stunt our growth and possibilities in terms of growing, deepening the value chain, developing our value chain, and really moving forward on the industrialization path in Africa. So of course you can't necessarily do it alone. There has to be a diverse aspect.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think we will conclude here. I did want to reiterate for students that we have basically one fellowship program being offered here by Professor Woods. We've got an internship being offered by Franklin Amoo. If I'm not mistaken, when I looked at Lakeisha's website, I saw "We Are Hiring" sign. So you have 3 companies here. Someone posed the question, how can we get involved? You have 3 individuals here who are basically offering you opportunities to get involved. Please check out our website, africa-awareness.org. We'll have bios, follow-up information for all the panelists you see today. Professor Piscopo, were you want to say something as well?
No, I was saying, can you send me again in an email all the links so I can post them or on our Blackboard page?
Definitely will do. Part of the whole.
Thank you very much for organizing this. I think it's been a great learning opportunity for my students. Very relevant to our class.
Indeed. Well, thank you all for your time. I think we will conclude there. And again, the biggest purpose of this conference is the follow-up opportunities also. So please stay engaged.
Thank you, everyone, for your time and your thoughts and your contributions.